She thought she would just sign the papers and forget about that place forever, but the island on the cold white lake, inherited from her late husband's grandfather, held something more than an old house and rotting boards. When the former military nurse Victoria Hayes sailed there with her young son, she found a bundle of yellowed letters, and in those letters hid the reason why the old man Arthur Croft refused to sell the island even when he had nothing left, a reason he took with him to the grave. But before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video, and if such stories touch your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what Victoria and her son found on that forgotten island changed their lives forever. The morning in Pittsburgh was cold and grey. A low sky hung over the industrial city, and the rare snow slowly melted on the asphalt, leaving dirty puddles on the streets. Victoria Hayes sat by the window of her small apartment on the 4th floor of an old panel building and held a mug of cool tea in her hands. Her palms were wide and strong, with noticeable scars on her fingers, a memory of a past life she tried not to recall. She was 35, a tall woman with a straight back and broad shoulders, the kind often seen in people accustomed to carrying heavy gear. Her hair, dark brown, was almost always tied in a simple ponytail, and her face seemed calm but a little tired. A thin pale scar ran across her left temple, a shard she had received many years ago while working as a military nurse. The war had taught her many things, the most important being silence. Now Victoria worked as a nurse in a city clinic. The job was quiet and monotonous, but that was exactly what she wanted after everything she had seen on the front lines. Ordinary life seemed almost a luxury. However, the silence of the apartment was different. It was too deep. On the wall above the sofa hung a photograph in a simple wooden frame. In it was her husband Gregory Hayes, a tall man with a thick dark beard and calm eyes. In the photo, he held a small boy in his arms, their son. 3 years had passed since then. 3 years since the day a military officer knocked on the door and uttered words that divided her life into before and after. Sometimes Victoria felt as if the apartment still held his breath, his mug in the kitchen, his old army knife in the drawer, his silence. From the next room came the sound of falling blocks. "Mom, look," rang out a clear voice. In the doorway appeared Alexander. He was 10 years old, a thin boy with tousled light hair and attentive grey-green eyes. He had inherited those eyes from his father. They always seemed too serious for a child. Alexander was a quiet boy, but there was liveliness in his movements. Now he held a wooden structure made of old toy blocks in his hands. "This is a ship," he said with pride. Victoria smiled. "It looks like a fortress." "This is a ship fortress," he corrected seriously. She nodded as if it were completely logical. Alexander was the anchor that held her in this life. For him she got up in the morning. For him she returned home. For him she learned to live again. On the kitchen table lay a stack of mail, advertisements, bills, receipts, ordinary things of ordinary life. Victoria was about to put them aside when she noticed an envelope among the papers that stood out. It was thick, cream-coloured. The name on it was written in neat handwriting with black ink. To Victoria Gregory Hayes. She frowned. The envelope smelled of old paper and dust. Inside was an official document. She read the first line and froze. The letter was from a notary's office in Anchorage. The text was dry and official, stating that she was the heir to property belonging to the late Arthur Croft. The name made her think. Croft, she whispered it quietly. Croft, that name surfaced somewhere in the depths of her memory, and suddenly she remembered. Grandfather of Gregory, she whispered. Alexander immediately raised his head. Whose grandfather? Your dad's. She looked at the letter again. According to the document, she inherited a small island on Silver Lake along with the buildings on it. Victoria even chuckled quietly. An island. It sounded almost absurd. She tried to remember if Gregory had ever spoken about his grandfather, and she recalled only one thing. Once, many years ago, they sat in the kitchen late at night. She asked him about his family. Gregory was silent for a long time, then said shortly, "He was a stubborn old man," and added nothing more. Every time the conversation returned to that topic, he changed it, as if something heavy stood behind that name. "Mom," Alexander said cautiously, "what does it say?" She looked at him. "It seems we've got an island." The boy's eyes instantly widened. "A real island?" "It seems so." He jumped to his feet. "Are there bears there?" "I hope not." "And a house?" "Probably." "And a boat?" She laughed for the first time in a long time. "I don't know." That same day, she called the notary's office number. A man with a calm voice answered. He introduced himself as Notary Nicholas Rogers. He was a man of about 50, judging by his voice, calm and businesslike. Such people spoke slowly and clearly, as if accustomed to dealing with other people's fates and documents. He confirmed the contents of the letter. The island indeed belonged to Arthur Croft after his death. No heirs were found, and only recently had they managed to establish a connection through the family archives of the Hayes. "There's one formality," said the notary. "What kind?" "You must personally inspect the property." "Why?" "Without that, sale or transfer is impossible." She thought. "So I need to go there?" "Yes." She looked at Alexander. He sat nearby and listened to the conversation with wide-open eyes. "All right," she said finally. "We will." 3 days later, they set off. The old car slowly moved north. The city gradually stayed behind, and endless coniferous forests began. The road stretched through villages where houses stood as if they were 100 years old. Sometimes Victoria caught herself in a strange feeling, as if they were driving not just north but back in time. By evening, they stopped at a small roadside diner. The building was wooden and smelled of smoke and pine resin. Behind the counter stood an old man. His name was Ephraim Daniels. He was a thin man of about 70 with a long grey beard and thick eyebrows. His face was etched with wrinkles like an old map. He moved slowly, but his eyes were lively. "Tea?" he asked. "Yes." When Victoria mentioned Croft's Island, the old man suddenly perked up. "Croft," he drawled. "Arthur Croft?" "Yes." He chuckled quietly. A stubborn man he was. Alexander immediately became interested. "Did you know him?" "A little." The old man set a teapot in front of them. "He built boats, the best boats on the whole lake." "And why did he?" The old man was silent for a long time, then said, "After his wife's death, he never left anywhere, and he didn't sell the island." The old man shook his head. "No, why?" The old man looked out the window at the darkening forest. "Because some places can't be sold." Before they left, he took out a small object from the drawer, an old bronze key, darkened with time. "He left it here many years ago," said the old man. "He said that one day someone would come for it." He handed the key to Victoria. "It seems you are that person." Victoria stared at the key for a long time. It was heavy and strangely cold. When they stepped outside, the air was already completely dark and quiet. Alexander walked beside her. "Mom." "Yes." "How do you think?" He looked at her with that special expression children have before the start of a great adventure. "What is there on that island?" Victoria looked at the road leading into the dark forest and suddenly felt a strange sensation, as if they were expected, or as if the past had just opened a door. What exactly did Arthur Croft leave on the island? And why was he sure that one day someone would return for that key? The lake met them with a cold wind and a grey sky. By morning, the road ended at a small wooden pier that seemed to grow right out of the rocky shore. Silver Lake lay before them. Wide and silent, its water seemed almost black under the heavy clouds. Victoria got out of the car and paused for a moment. The air here was different, colder, cleaner. It smelled of damp pine bark, water, and distant snow. Alexander immediately ran to the edge of the pier. "Mom, look." He pointed to a dark spot in the middle of the lake. The island. It was larger than Victoria had expected. A small hill covered with dense pines and birches rose straight from the water. Above the trees towered the roof of an old house, that very house. At the pier was tied a boat, an old wooden boat with darkened sides. It looked sturdy but very old on its bow. One could still make out a carved letter C. Victoria took out the bronze key given to them by Ephraim Daniels. Next to the pier was a small metal lock holding the boat on a chain. The key entered it easily. The lock opened almost without resistance. Alexander looked at her in awe. "He really was waiting for us." Victoria said nothing. She simply untied the boat. They sailed in silence. The oars quietly cut through the water. The lake was calm, but its silence was deep and ancient. Sometimes birds flew over the water, and their cries sounded especially loud. With each minute, the island grew closer. Alexander couldn't sit still. "Are there parts there?" "Maybe." "And if there are bears?" "Then you'll be the first to see them." He laughed, but Victoria felt a strange tension. It wasn't fear, rather a sense of approaching a place that had long held someone's memory. When the boat touched the shore, the water quietly splashed against the rocks. The island greeted them with the smell of moss and needles. The ground underfoot was soft. Thick green moss grew between the rocks, and birches leaned toward the water as if listening to its breath. Alexander stepped ashore first. "We are home," he said solemnly. The words sounded unexpected. Home. Victoria raised her gaze. The house indeed stood almost in the center of the island, a wooden cabin, old but still holding up. Its roof had sagged a bit, and the walls had darkened with time. The porch was overgrown with grass, but in its outlines there was a stubborn resilience, as if it refused to fall. Victoria slowly climbed the creaking steps. The door was unlocked. She pushed it, and the hinges quietly groaned. Inside it was dark and cold, but not ruined. The room was small. In the center stood a table. Next to it, an old stove. On the wall hung a lamp. Everything was covered with a thin layer of dust, but things stood neatly. Pots hung on hooks, tools lay on a shelf. Someone had once lived here very carefully. Alexander immediately began exploring the house. "Mom, there's a ladder here." In the corner of the room was a narrow wooden ladder leading to the attic. Victoria climbed up after him. The attic was filled with the old smell of wood, and dust-grey light filtered through a small window. There lay nets, old boxes, fishing gear, and several crates. Alexander was already rummaging in one of them. "Look." He lifted a photograph. Victoria took it. In the shot was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick dark beard and stern eyes. His face was rough, as if carved from stone by the winds of northern lakes. This was Arthur Croft. Next to him stood a boy of about 6, and Victoria felt her heart clench. The boy was almost an exact copy of Gregory. The same eyes, the same facial shape. She ran her finger over the photograph. "So he did come here after all," she said quietly. Alexander leaned closer. "That's Dad's grandfather?" "Yes." She looked around. The attic was full of things, but none seemed random. Each lay in its place, as if the owner of the house wasn't planning to leave forever. After half an hour, Alexander ran off to explore the island. He dashed between the pines, found old paths and rocky outcrops. Sometimes his voice came from afar. "Mom, there are tracks here. It's probably a fox. And mushrooms here." He looked happy, truly happy. Victoria hadn't seen him like that in a long time. She sat on the porch of the house and looked at the lake. The wind passed through the pines, and their tops quietly rustled. The sound was deep and soft, like breathing. By evening, the island began to change. The light became golden, and the lake's water reflected the sky like a mirror. Victoria suddenly realized that for the first time in many years, she heard true silence, not urban, not empty, but alive. She heard the wind in the needles, splashes of water, bird cries, and even her own breath. Alexander returned to the house, all covered in needles and dirt. "Mom, there's a small bay here," he said quickly, excitedly. "You can catch fish there." She looked at him. "Do you like it here?" He nodded without hesitation. "Very much." In the evening, they built a small fire near the house. The sky gradually darkened. The pines became black silhouettes. When night finally fell on the island, Victoria lay on the old bed in the house. Alexander fell asleep almost immediately. She, however, couldn't close her eyes for a long time. The house quietly creaked. Sometimes the wind passed through the walls, and in those moments, it seemed to her that the house was breathing, as if the old tree was remembering everything it had seen. She thought about Gregory, about why he never spoke of this place, and about why his grandfather had lived here so long, alone. When she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of the lake and the old house that was waiting. In the morning, she went out to the porch. Fog lay over the water. The island seemed almost fairy tale-like. Alexander was already sitting by the shore, throwing stones into the water. "Mom." "Yes." "Can we stay here a little?" She looked at the house, the pines, the calm water, and suddenly realized she didn't want to leave right away. "A few days," she said. Alexander smiled. At that moment, the wind quietly passed through the pine branches, and Victoria suddenly felt a strange thought, as if the island really had been waiting for them. But if so, what other traces of the past had Arthur Croft left here, and what exactly was he trying to preserve on this forgotten island? The morning on the island came slowly, as if cautiously stepping over the cold lake water. Grey fog hung between the pines, and their tops seemed distant and ghostly. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the air already smelled of damp earth and old wood. Victoria woke up before Alexander. The old cabin still breathed the night's coolness. The boards quietly creaked, as if the wood was getting used to new people. She threw on a warm jacket and went to the window. The lake was motionless. Sometimes a ripple passed over the water, as if someone invisible touched it with fingers. Alexander was still asleep on the old sofa, Wrapped in a blanket, his light hair was tousled, and his face looked surprisingly calm. In such moments, he seemed very small again. Victoria quietly went to the corner of the room. There stood an old chest. She had noticed it yesterday, but then there was no energy left to sort through things. The chest was heavy, made of thick oak boards. The metal corners were covered with dark patina. The lid creaked when she lifted it. Inside lay neatly folded things. An old wool sweater, fishing gloves, a small knife with a wooden handle, and under them a bundle of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. Victoria carefully took it. The ribbon was soft from time, almost crumbling in her fingers. She untied it. Inside were letters, many letters. On each envelope, in neat handwriting, was written the name Gregory Hayes. Her heart stopped for a second. She slowly sank into a chair and opened the first letter. The handwriting was large, confident the ink had blurred a bit from moisture. Gregory, today the wind broke one of the pines near the pier again. I fixed the roof, but the boards are aging faster than I am. Victoria read slowly. The letters were written many years ago. In the first lines, Arthur Croft wrote almost calmly. He told of winters, of how the ice on the lake sometimes cracks at night so loudly that it seems the world is splitting in half. He wrote about repairing the house, the boat, the fish, but between the lines, loneliness was felt. In one letter, he wrote, "Today I saw the fox again. She comes to the house for the second winter now. Probably we both are more accustomed to this island than to people." Victoria caught herself thinking that she was reading these lines as if listening to the voice of an old man, a voice she had never heard. Alexander woke up and came to her. "What are you reading?" "Letters." "Whose?" "Your dad's grandfather's." He sat beside her. The next letter was written later. The handwriting became a little less even. "Gregory, I don't know if you receive my letters, but I continue to write. Sometimes a person needs to speak, even if only to paper." Victoria felt a heaviness slowly rising inside her. The letters became more personal. In one of them, Arthur mentioned his wife for the first time. After Mary's death, the island became different. The silence here is heavier now. Mary, that name had never been spoken in the family before. Victoria tried to imagine this woman, probably a calm northern woman with soft hands accustomed to cold water and a quiet voice. The loss of such a person could leave a huge emptiness. She continued reading. "I thought of leaving, but every time I prepared, I realized. If I go, the last place where our family still exists will disappear." Victoria stopped. That phrase was written slowly, as if the person had thought long over each word. "This island is the last place where our family still exists." She reread it again, and suddenly much became clearer. Gregory never spoke of his grandfather, not because he hated him, but because there was an unfinished story between them. Alexander quietly asked, "Was he a bad person?" Victoria shook her head. "No." She looked at the letters. "He was just lonely." In the chest, a few more papers remained. Among them lay a thick roll. She carefully unrolled it. These were blueprints, large sheets of thick paper with neatly drawn lines of a house, not the one where they now sat, but another, sturdier one. The foundation was wider. The beams crossed at strange angles. Victoria immediately understood. This man knew how to build. At the bottom of the blueprint was a signature. The handwriting was the same, but the letters trembled. "A house that will withstand loneliness." Alexander looked at the drawing with wide-open eyes. He wanted to build a new house. It seemed so. She carefully examined the blueprint. Every line was thought out. This was a house designed for long winters, strong winds, loneliness. "Why didn't he build it?" asked the boy. Victoria was silent. She turned over. One of the sheets. On the back was a short note. "If you ever return, finish it." Victoria's heart clenched. She felt a strange sensation, as if the letter was written not only to Gregory but also to her. She looked at the window. Beyond the glass stood pines and the old house that had waited for people for many years. Alexander suddenly said, "Mom, yes, we can build it." She chuckled. "We?" "Yes." He pointed to the blueprint. He wanted someone to finish it. Victoria looked at her son's hands, thin fingers, small calluses. He was no longer as small as before. She glanced at the blueprint again and suddenly felt something strange. Not fear, not doubt, rather a quiet thought. Maybe this house really was waiting. She carefully folded the letters back, but one phrase continued to echo in her head. "A house that will withstand loneliness." And suddenly she thought of something else. If Arthur Croft wrote so many letters to Gregory, why did none of them ever reach him? The morning was cold, but clear. The sun broke through the pines, and its rays lay in long strips on the damp island earth. Victoria sat on the steps of the old cabin, holding Arthur Croft's folded blueprints in her hands. The paper was thick and slightly yellowed with time, but the lines remained clear, as if the man who drew them wanted to be sure he would be understood even after many years. Alexander stood beside her and looked at the drawing so attentively, as if it were a treasure map. "We can build it," he said again. His voice sounded confident, as if he didn't doubt for a second. Victoria chuckled quietly. "Do you know how much strength it takes to build a house?" "A lot. And time." "We have time." She looked at her son. He was a slender boy with long arms and legs, a bit awkward like all children in their growth period. His light hair stuck out in different directions, and his face always had an expression of concentrated curiosity. Alexander reminded her of Gregory, only there was more light in him. Victoria looked at the blueprint again. She had never built houses, but in the army, she had learned one important rule. If a task seems too difficult, break it into small steps. "All right," she said finally. Alexander froze. "Really?" "We'll try." He jumped for joy. "Really?" She nodded. "But first, we need to clear the site." They found a suitable spot not far from the water. Several young pines grew there, and the ground was relatively flat. Victoria took an old axe found in the shed next to the house. It was heavy, with a darkened wooden handle. The blade was still sharp. She checked the balance. The tool was well made, strong, like everything Arthur did. The first tree fell heavily. The axe bit into the trunk with a dull sound. Victoria worked slowly but confidently. Her shoulder muscles quickly remembered the old strength. When the pine finally tilted and crashed to the ground, Alexander clapped his hands. "You're like a real lumberjack." She laughed. "No, just a stubborn woman." The first days were hard. They cleared the site, dragged logs, collected stones. Sometimes Victoria felt fatigue rising from her legs to her back, but strangely, it was a good fatigue, alive. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. The flames illuminated the pines, and their shadows moved on the ground. Alexander began carving small boats from wood. He found a knife in an old toolbox, a small one with a bone handle. The blade was short but sharp. "This will be a fleet," he said one day. "A fleet?" "Yes." He placed 3 small boats on the ground. "They will protect our island." Victoria watched him and felt a strange warmth. Sometimes a child can see meaning where adults see only labor. The work gradually became part of their days. Chopping wood in the morning, carrying logs during the day, fire and conversations in the evening. Victoria noticed her body changing. Her arms became stronger, movements more confident. The strength she had once lost with the war was returning. After a week, they began laying the foundation of the house. Victoria carefully studied the blueprint. Arthur was a clever builder. The foundation had to be deep, the beams crossed so that the wind couldn't easily shift the walls. She sometimes caught herself thinking that she was talking to this old man through the lines on the paper. "Here he wanted to reinforce the corner," she said. Alexander listened seriously. "So the entrance will be here." "It seems so." When the first beams lay on the ground, Victoria felt a strange feeling, as if something began to move, not the house, her own life. Each new timber made her thoughts calmer. Sometimes she even caught herself smiling for no reason. One evening, Alexander noticed it. "Mom, yes, you laughed today." She was surprised. "Really?" "Yes." He looked at her attentively. "You haven't laughed like that in a long time." She thought he was right. After Gregory's death, her life had become quiet and cautious. She had learned not to feel too much. But here, among the pines, something was changing. The work went slowly but steadily. The foundation of the house was already ready. In a few days, they began raising the walls. The wind on the lake sometimes strengthened, and then the pines began to hum like a huge organ, but the house stood. Alexander said one day, "It will be stronger than the old one." Victoria looked at the structure. It was simple, uneven, but strength was already felt in it. She understood one important thing. This house was built not only from logs, it was built from their patience, their stubbornness, from memory. That evening, they sat by the fire. The sky was clear, and the stars reflected in the lake's water. Victoria suddenly said, "You know, your great-grandfather was a stubborn man." Alexander smiled. "Like you." She laughed. "Possibly." But at that moment, the wind suddenly strengthened sharply. The pines rustled somewhere in the distance. A branch cracked. Victoria raised her head. The sky was quickly darkening. Heavy clouds gathered on the horizon. She felt a familiar sensation, the one that appeared before a strong storm. Sometimes nature reminds a person of one simple thing. It is always stronger. And Victoria suddenly realized that their new house would soon face its first test. But would this house and their new life withstand a real northern storm? Night fell on the island quickly, and heavily dark clouds covered the stars, and the air filled with the anxious hum of the wind. First, Victoria heard it far over the lake, a dull, low sound, as if the water itself began to move. She woke up almost instantly. The old cabin quietly creaked, as if warning. Through the cracks in the walls, cold wind already seeped in. Victoria got up from the bed and went to the window. The lake had disappeared where stars had reflected in the evening. Now black water raged. Waves rose and crashed against the island's rocks. She quietly exhaled. It has begun. Alexander woke up from another gust of wind against the walls. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes. Mom! Storm! He went to the window and pressed against the glass. The wind grew stronger. The pines on the island bent so low that their tops almost touched the ground. Victoria felt familiar sensations in the war. She had heard this sound more than once, the sound of approaching force that couldn't be stopped. She knew what would happen now. "We need to check the house," she said. They threw on jackets and went outside. The rain hit their faces immediately, cold drops almost icy. The unfinished house stood not far from the old cabin. Its walls were already up, but the roof remained unfinished. The wind hit the beams, and the wooden frame groaned. "It holds," said Victoria. But at that moment, there was a loud crack. At first, she thought it was thunder, but the sound was closer, much closer. They turned their heads at the same time. A tall birch standing at the edge of the clearing slowly tilted. Its roots tore from the earth. Alexander, back. But it was too late. The tree fell with a crash. The huge trunk hit right into the unfinished roof. The beams cracked. One wall skewed. Part of the structure collapsed to the ground. Victoria froze. The wind continued to howl. Rain streamed down her face. She looked at the destroyed house and felt a heavy fatigue rising inside. A week of work, endless hours of chopping, all efforts shattered by one blow. Alexander came closer. "Mom." She slowly shook her head. "We won't make it." The words came out quietly but heavily. She looked at the wet logs. This was a bad idea. Alexander was silent. "We'll leave," she continued. "Return to the city." Victoria suddenly felt a familiar fear, the one that appeared after Gregory's death, the fear of building something new because everything can be lost. She whispered, "I don't want to lose everything again." Alexander stood before her, wet from the rain. His light hair stuck to his forehead, but his eyes remained calm. He said quietly, "Remember the letter?" Victoria didn't answer. It said. He tried to recall. That a house is built not when everything is calm. She looked at him. Those were Arthur's words. So he knew there would be a storm. Victoria suddenly felt something changing inside her. She looked at the destroyed frame, then at her son. Sometimes children see the truth faster than adults. She took a deep breath. "All right." Alexander was surprised. "Really? We won't leave." She took the axe. "First, we'll remove the tree." The wind continued to rage. Rain lashed their faces, but they began to work. Victoria chopped the birch branches. Heavy branches fell to the ground. Alexander dragged them aside. The work was hard. Sometimes the wind almost knocked them off their feet, but they continued, hour after hour. Gradually, the trunk freed the roof. Some beams were broken, but the foundation remained intact. "So it wasn't all for nothing," said Victoria. She lifted one of the fallen beams. "We'll just build it anew." By morning, the storm began to subside. The clouds slowly parted. A pale morning sky appeared over the lake. The island looked exhausted. Branches lay on the ground. Some pines were broken, but the house still stood, albeit crooked, not perfect, but alive. Alexander sat on a log and sighed heavily. "We did it." Victoria wiped the rain from her face. She looked at the house frame and suddenly felt a strange pride, not because the house was beautiful, but because they hadn't left. Sometimes victory is simply staying. She placed her hand on her son's shoulder. "Now it will definitely withstand the storm." Alexander smiled. They stood among the wet logs and the fresh morning light, and Victoria suddenly understood one simple thing. This house was built not only from wood. It was built from stubbornness, from memory, from love. But at that moment, She didn't yet know that the island's trials were just beginning, because sometimes the strongest wind comes not from the lake but from the mainland, and very soon a boat would appear on the horizon that could bring an offer capable of changing everything. The morning was quiet and transparent. A light fog hung over Silver Lake, and the sun slowly rose from behind the distant forest, painting the water with soft silvery light. Victoria stood near the new house. Now it was almost complete. The walls stood firmly, the roof was covered with fresh boards, and only a few details still needed work. She ran her palm over a smooth beam. The wood was warm. Sometimes it seemed to her that the house really lived, that it remembered their steps, their voices, their labor. Alexander sat nearby on a large stone and carved a new boat from a piece of birch branch. His knife moved cautiously, almost professionally. Next to him on the ground stood 4 small wooden boats already. "The 5th will be the fastest," he said. "The fastest," smiled Victoria. "Yes, it will be the Scout." She chuckled quietly. This island was changing both of them. Somewhere over the water, a seagull cried. Victoria was about to return to work when she heard a sound, first quiet, then louder, a low rumble of an engine. She raised her head. On the horizon appeared a dot. In a few minutes, it became clear. A boat, not an old fishing boat, but a motorized one, white, shiny, with a closed cabin. It moved quickly and confidently. Alexander noticed it too. "Who is that?" Victoria squinted. "I don't know." The boat approached and stopped at the shore. A man stepped out. His movements were calm and confident, the way people move who are accustomed to feeling like masters of any situation. This was Leo Barton. He was a tall man of about 40, broad shoulders, neat short haircut, smoothly shaved face with sharp features. His eyes were light gray, attentive, appraising. He wore an expensive dark coat and leather gloves. Such people are rarely random guests. He climbed the rocks and stopped before Victoria. "Good morning." His voice was calm and confident. "Are you Victoria Hayes?" She nodded. "Yes." He smiled. "My name is Leo Barton. I represent the Northern Shore Company." Alexander watched him attentively. Barton cast a short glance at the unfinished house. "It seems you've decided to stay here." "For now, yes." He took a few steps around the site, surveying the island. His gaze was attentive, too attentive, like that of a person accustomed to evaluating the cost of things. "Beautiful place," he said. "Yes, and very promising." Victoria was silent. Barton opened a leather folder. "I'll speak directly." He spoke calmly, but his voice had a habit of persuading. "Our company has been developing tourist infrastructure around Silver Lake for several years." He pointed his hand at the water. "A few miles from here, we are building a new resort." Alexander frowned. "A resort?" Barton smiled at him politely. "Yes, hotels, marinas, restaurants." He looked at Victoria again. "But your island occupies an ideal location." Victoria was already beginning to understand. "You want to buy it." "Exactly." He pulled documents from the folder. "We are ready to offer you a very serious amount." She didn't take the papers. Barton continued. "With this money, you can buy a house in any city." He looked at Alexander. "Your son can study in the best schools." Alexander gripped his wooden boat tighter. Victoria looked at the lake. The wind quietly moved the water. She remembered Arthur's words. "This island is the last place where our family still exists." Barton spoke further. "I understand that this place has emotional value." He smiled. "But life requires practical decisions." His voice was soft, almost convincing, and for a second, Victoria felt familiar sensations. The city, work, apartment, bills, all those things she had once grown tired of. She looked at Alexander. He stood nearby, quiet, but his eyes were attentive. He held the small wooden boat carved by his own hands, and suddenly Victoria understood. This island had already changed them. She turned to Barton. "No." He blinked. "Excuse me. We are not selling the island." He sighed. "You probably don't understand the scale of the offer." "I understand." She looked at him calmly. "But this place is not for sale." Barton was silent for a moment, then said, "Money can change life." Victoria nodded. "I know." She looked at the house, the pines, the lake. "But some things can't be bought." Barton closed the folder. He was a smart man and understood that the conversation was over. "If you change your mind," he said, "contact me." He returned to the boat in a few minutes, The engine roared again, the boat slowly went toward the mainland, and when it disappeared beyond the horizon, the island plunged into silence again. Alexander approached his mother. "Are we really not selling?" Victoria placed her hand on his shoulder. "No." He smiled. "Good." The wind quietly passed through the pines. The house stood behind them, sturdy, alive, and Victoria suddenly realized she had made the right choice. But one question remained ahead. If Arthur Croft had guarded this island so long, what final secret did he leave for those who decide to stay here? Autumn came to the island quietly. Like a cautious guest, the pines became darker, and the birches flared with gold, like small fires amid the grey sky. Victoria stood at the threshold of the new house and looked at the lake now the house was finished. It was small, just one room, a small stove, a narrow window overlooking the water, but the walls stood even, the roof was strong, and the logs smelled of fresh resin. It looked as if it had always stood here. Alexander ran out from around the corner of the house, holding a knife and a piece of wood in his hands. "Mom, look." He pointed to one of the beams above the door. On it were neatly carved letters. V+A. "These are our initials," he said with pride. Victoria ran her fingers over the fresh carvings. "So the house now knows who lives here." Alexander smiled. "And what shall we name it?" She looked at the house, then at the lake and the pines that quietly rustled in the cold wind. "House of the Northern Fire," she said. Alexander repeated quietly. "House of the Northern Fire." The name sounded right. In the evening, they lit a fire in the stove. For the first time the flames rose slowly, and warm light filled the room with soft orange glow. Victoria sat at the table with a small notebook. It was an old notepad found in Arthur's chest. On the first pages were the old man's notes, short entries about the weather, fish, wind. She turned a few pages and began writing. "Today we finished the house. It is small but strong, and it seems it will stand for a long time." Alexander lay on the floor near the stove and examined his wooden boats. Now there were already 7 of them. "Mom." "Yes." "Do you think great-grandfather would approve?" Victoria looked at the house walls, the beams, the ceiling. "I think yes." She opened the box with Arthur's letters again. She had reread them many times, but each time found something new. At the bottom of the box lay another envelope, small, almost unnoticed. She frowned. This envelope was sealed. On it were written just a few words. "To the one who stays." Victoria's heart slowly thumped against her chest. She carefully opened the letter. The paper was thin and trembled slightly in her hands. Arthur's handwriting was weaker than in the other letters. "If you are reading this, it means the island has found a new guardian." Victoria froze. She read further. "I thought long about why a person needs a place he cannot leave, and I realized. Not because he is weak, but because there are things that cannot be left." She looked at the window. Beyond the glass lay the lake, calm, deep. This island was never just land, it was memory. If you stayed here, it means you understood that. Victoria slowly lowered the letter. Alexander looked at her. "What does it say?" She smiled. "He says the island has found a new guardian." The boy thought, "That's us?" She nodded. "It seems so." Alexander got up and went to the door. He looked at the dark lake. "Then we must take good care of it." Victoria felt her chest fill with calm. She looked at the letter again and suddenly understood what she must do. The next day, she took a new page in the notebook and began writing. "If you found this letter, it means many years have passed. I don't know who you are, but I know one thing. This island knows how to wait." She wrote for a long time, about the house, the wind, her son, about how hard it sometimes is to start a new life. When the letter was finished, she folded it and carefully placed it in a glass jar. Then she went to the wall near the stove. There, between the logs, remained a small gap. She removed one board and hid the jar inside. Alexander watched her. "This is for those who come after us?" "Yes." He nodded. "Then the island will remember." In the evening, they sat on the porch. The sun set behind the forest. The lake became golden. Victoria looked at the water and thought about how strangely life sometimes unfolds. She had come here only to sign papers and leave, but instead found a home. Alexander said quietly, "Mom." "Yes." "We live here now." She smiled. "It seems so." He hugged her shoulders. Night slowly fell on the island. The house of the Northern Fire stood quietly among the pines. Soft light burned in its window, and Victoria suddenly understood a simple truth. A home is not walls. A home is a place where memory turns into hope, and where a person learns to live again. Sometimes we think that miracles happen somewhere far away, in great stories, in books, or in the fates of other people. But the truth is that the quietest miracles happen precisely in our ordinary lives, when a person doesn't give up, when he rises again after loss, when he chooses love over fear. Victoria came to the island only to close a page of the past, but it was there that she understood a simple truth. Sometimes God leads us through the most difficult roads to return us to where our soul can breathe again. Sometimes a miracle is not a loud event. Sometimes a miracle is a house we build with our own hands. Sometimes a miracle is a child who reminds us that hope is still alive. Perhaps in your life too there is a place that God has prepared just for you, a place where pain one day turns into strength and memory into new hope. If this story has touched your heart, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Share this story with those who need hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new stories about faith, strength, and miracles that God quietly creates in the lives of ordinary people. May the Lord bless you and your home. May He protect your family, give you peace in your heart, and light on every step of your path.